Horror, for all its glory, didn't just evolve in the 2010s, it grew up. This was a decade where horror started to be more than just monsters hiding in the dark and started to be more about grief, trauma, and the quiet dread of everyday life. The 2010s transformed horror into something slower, stranger, and way more personal. Jump scares started to take a back seat and symbolism took over, and suddenly, horror films were being discussed like art house dramas. So today we're breaking down how the 2010s reimagined and reshaped the genre, from its themes to cinematography and some of those subgenres that pretty much dominated the decade and made numerous horror movies that are unforgettable. Alright, Spooky Gang, so at the start of the 2010s, horror in a lot of ways was still living in the shadow of the 2000s. Found footage films still ruled the theaters, and low budget supernatural films dominated the box offices. We got movies like Insidious, which was great in its own right. Most people are well aware of that as a James Wan masterpiece. Movies like Black Swan, Paranormal Activity 2, so the sequel to Paranormal Activity that came out in 2007. Let Me In, the movie Devil. In 2011, you had movies like The Innkeepers, The Awakening, Final Destination 5, the Fright Night remake, and The Woman in Black. 2012, you had Sinister, Would You Rather, VHS, The Possession. Audiences overall were getting tired of cheap scares. They wanted atmosphere, they wanted meaning, and most importantly, they wanted horror that was going to linger on well past the movie's credits. And by the middle of the decade, horror officially shifted. And here comes our elevated horror movies. The term elevated horror became controversial, but it was unavoidable, honestly. When you had movies that dropped like The Babadook, Hereditary, The Witch, and Saint Maud, they weren't just trying to scare you, they were about grief, they were about mental illness, family trauma, loss. In these films, and a lot of times in some of the other horror movies that came out around this time, the monsters were invisible, or sometimes it was internal. In a lot of cases, fear comes from silence, from lingering shots, and just overall uncomfortable emotions that genuinely felt real. You think from a visual aspect of what the 2010s brought in the cinematography, they started having many more wide shots that made the characters in the film feel smaller and more powerless. Symmetry in those long takes that I was mentioning just really sort of adds to the dread and adds to the terror. Directors really started to let scenes breathe, so just like let it just be and let the audience just become uncomfortable just by, in a lot of cases, kind of watching nothing in terms of action, but just really being immersed into the atmosphere. Some films that I think do that the best, there's movies like It Follows that I absolutely adore, and everybody who is a fan of this channel knows that that's one of my favorite movies of all time. There's movies like The Lighthouse, As Above, So Below. They really use clean and really, in a lot of cases, beautiful imagery, and it made the horrific moments hit that much harder. So horror overall stopped looking cheap and really started looking more pristine. And as the decade progressed, we got one of the bigger elements within the shift that happened in horror, which was how openly horror started to address our society. When you think of the movie Get Out from 2017, it turned racial anxiety into psychological terror. Movies like The Purge explored class division and systemic violence. A movie like Us examined privilege, identity, and the fear of ourselves. So it's like, in a way, horror became a mirror, forcing audiences to confront real-world fears in exaggerated and unsettling ways. And then also within the decade, you have the return of folk and occult horror. And a lot of these have to do with isolated communities, ancient rituals, and pagan symbolism and things of that nature. So when you think of movies like The Witch and Midsommar, even though I'm not a fan of that movie at all, but still, those movies are the type of movies that will represent that. And as I mentioned, there was also the rise and the fall of found footage. Earlier in the 2010s, found footage could be found everywhere, from those Paranormal Activity movies that I mentioned, and other movies like The Gallows and some of the other ones that I really do enjoy. But by the mid-2010s, audiences for the most part were burnt out. But there were other bangers during that time which really helped revitalize and refresh the decade. Movies like The Conjuring 2, Don't Breathe, The Wailing, Lights Out, 10 Cloverfield Lane, which is a sequel to Cloverfield. As I mentioned earlier, Get Out, the It remake, Gerald's Game, Happy Death Day. A lot of these movies came through in the clutch and really gave us something a little different than our traditional found footage movies, than the found footage movies that we watched all in the early 2010s and a good bit in the 2000s. And again, a lot of what the 2010s did as well is making humans the real monster. So when you think of this aspect, you think of movies that are about abusive families, cults, manipulators, social systems, Hereditary, The Invitation, Ready or Not, Don't Breathe, and even extension of legacy horror franchises like Halloween 2018, Doctor Sleep, And all of those, all of these movies reminded audiences that real horror doesn't always have to come from claws and fangs. And another aspect that the 2010s normalized was the use of ambiguous endings. This, in a lot of cases, created a lot of audience discussions because film stopped explaining everything. They just trusted the viewers to think, debate, and rewatch and, sort of form their own opinion and perspective on what may have happened in a certain event, or what the overall themes are of this movie, so on and so forth. And this is where it was really popularized on things like YouTube, where there are a lot of videos where people were doing movie breakdowns and movies about, hey, what did this really mean in such and such movie? If you didn't understand this in the movie, watch this video, or blah blah blah, so on and so forth. And by the end of the decade, horror was completely transformed. It was smarter, it was more emotional, and more divisive. The 2010s essentially proved that horror didn't have to play it safe, and that fear could be beautiful, symbolic, and deeply personal. This decade changed horror forever, and it's easily one of my favorite decades of horror of all time. Just so many of my favorite horror movies came out during this decade, and I couldn't have any more appreciation for it. But that is all I have, Spooky Gang. Y'all comment down below what you think of 2010's horror and some of these aspects, some of the things that they did in 2010s. Did you really appreciate some of the things that they brought, or do you not appreciate that because of introducing things like elevated horror? And now in the 2020s decade so far, it's a good bit of elevated horror. Even stuff that shouldn't be elevated sometimes is elevated. So all of these different aspects, what did you think of 2010's horror? And what are some of your favorite horror movies from the 2010s decade? Y'all comment that down below. Spooky Gang, I have good news for y'all. I just got a new setup, so I've made a big dent into my goal of really getting into the horror gaming aspect. And so, like I mentioned, we could do Fright Night Fridays or Spooky Saturdays, or whatever it is, and we just live stream games. You guys jump in on the chat and we just chop it up and have a good time. So we are many steps closer to that. And one thing I want to ask of you all is if you have any particular recommendations for some horror games that I can play. I typically am really huge into those horror games where something is chasing you or something like that. It's just really dark, really, stuff like that. I'm not overly the biggest fan of zombie type video games, but I'm definitely open to those as well. So yeah, y'all drop some of those down below, some of those recommendations, and that would be greatly appreciated. But Spooky Gang, y'all already know how we rocking. We're on the road to 10K subs. We're gonna keep grinding until we hit that. Y'all already know how we do. So till next time, Spooky Gang, y'all stay blessed and y'all stay spooky.